The door slid open with a hiss, and 3 of my colleagues walked out of the briefing room looking like they had just been told they were assigned to clean the station's waste recycling units with their bare hands. Lieutenant Greg Holt caught my eye, shook his head slowly and mouthed 2 words, "Not you." Then he kept walking, staring at the floor as if looking back might somehow drag him into whatever he had just escaped. I walked in anyway, because that is the kind of person I am. The kind who walks into rooms he should avoid. Commander Reyes was standing at the far end of the table with his arms crossed and an expression that said he had already used up his patience for the day and possibly for the rest of the week. He looked at me with something that was almost relief, which immediately made me nervous. "Ethan," he said, "close the door. My name is Ethan Cole. I am 28 years old. I grew up in a mid-sized town in Ohio, the kind of place where the biggest event of the year is the autumn fair, and everyone knows your grandmother. I joined the coalition diplomatic security division because it seemed like a stable career and because my aptitude scores were strong in observation and de-escalation. I am not a hero. I am not a decorated soldier. I am the person supervisors describe as reliable and low maintenance, which are compliments that sound like they belong on a product label rather than a personnel file. I closed the door and sat down. Reyes put a holographic display on the table between us. It showed a tall, silver-skinned figure in robes that seemed to shift colors slightly depending on the angle, like oil on water. The face was angular with high cheekbones that could have cut glass and eyes the color of deep space, a dark violet black that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Everything about the image communicated one thing: this individual had never once in their entire life been told no and accepted it. That, said Reyes, is Empress Valithra of the Athori Dominion. She arrived on Station Caldera 2 hours ago with a delegation of 42. She is here for the Meridian Peace Summit. The negotiations are supposed to run for 12 days. In the past 6 hours she has reduced 4 of our best diplomatic liaison officers to a state that the station counselor is now describing as professionally shaken. One of them asked to be reassigned to cargo inspection. He specifically requested the night shift. I looked at the image for a moment. What happened to the others who were supposed to guard her? Reyes made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Martinez told her that the station's ambient lighting could be adjusted to her preference. She informed him in front of her entire retinue that his offer implied she was fragile, and that fragility was a trait she found exclusively in prey animals. He handed in his rotation request before the hour was up. Reyes rubbed the back of his neck. Chin lasted 40 minutes. The Empress apparently asked him a question about human diplomatic history. He gave an answer she considered historically inaccurate. She corrected him in 4 languages, 2 of which he didn't know existed. I nodded slowly. "And you need me to take the post?" "I need someone to take the post," Reyes said. "You're the only one left in this rotation who hasn't drawn a straw yet. And honestly, Cole, your file says something that none of the others had going for them." "What does it say?" He paused just long enough to make me uncertain. "It says you don't talk unless you have something to say." So that was how it started, not with fanfare, not with any great sense of destiny. I was assigned to guard the most powerful being in 3-star systems because I happened to be the last person standing and because I had a reputation for keeping my mouth shut. I picked up my posted kit, checked my credentials, and walked to the diplomatic residential wing of Station Caldera, which was the part of the station that smelled like recycled air and expensive imported vegetation. Someone had brought real plants. There were tall, narrow things in silver pots that I didn't recognize, with leaves that were almost black at the edges and a faint blue-green at the center. They lined the corridor outside the Empress's suite like a welcoming party that had forgotten to smile. Her retinue was still settling in when I arrived. 2 of them, taller than me by a full head and wearing armor that was more decorative than practical, looked at me the way you look at a piece of furniture you are not sure belongs in the room. One of them said something in etheric that I didn't catch. The other one made a sound I took to be amusement. I stood at my post. I did not respond. I did not look directly at them. I watched the corridor in the way I had been trained to watch corridors, which is calmly, without drama, cataloging exits and angles and anything that moved. Then the door at the end of the hall opened and Empress Valithra walked out. She was taller than her holographic image had suggested. The robe she wore in the image had been formal, but what she had on now was something that looked like working clothing for a ruler, still layered and precise, but designed for movement. She walked the way people walk when they have never once considered whether they belong somewhere, because the concept of not belonging is simply not part of their experience. Every step was exact. Her dark eyes swept the corridor in a single pass and landed on me with the kind of focused attention that I was not prepared for. I did not meet her gaze directly, not because I was trying to be clever or culturally sensitive. I was just slightly overwhelmed, and when I am overwhelmed, I tend to look at the middle distance rather than directly at people. It is a habit I developed in school and never shook. She stopped, not dramatically, not with any visible reaction. She simply stopped, and for a moment the entire corridor went very quiet. I shifted my weight slightly, the way you do when you realize you have done something but are not sure what. Then one of her attendants said something to her in a low voice, and she turned away and continued down the hall. That was the whole of our first meeting. She walked past. I stood there. She stopped for a moment and then she kept going. I spent the rest of my shift wondering what I had done wrong. The answer, as I found out much later, was nothing. To an Arthurian, direct eye contact is a challenge. It is what you do when you want to start something, when you want to establish dominance or question authority. Every single guard and liaison officer who had interacted with her that day had maintained steady eye contact out of professional habit, and she had read every single one of them as provocative. I looked away because I was nervous and slightly bad at eye contact. In general, she had read it as something else entirely: restraint, discipline, a deliberate choice not to challenge her. She thought I was showing profound respect through practice control. I was just a person from Ohio who gets a little flustered in high-pressure situations. The end of my shift, as I was preparing to be relieved, the door to her suite opened. One of her attendants, the taller of the two, who had looked at me like furniture, came out and stood in front of me with the posture of someone delivering a statement rather than having a conversation. Her Imperial Majesty, he said in very precise and accented standard, requests that the current guard designation be maintained for the duration of her stay. I blinked. Me specifically, he looked at me as if the question was beneath addressing the current guard designation, he repeated. Then he went back inside. I stood there for a moment in the empty corridor with the strange black-edged plants in their silver pots and thought about what Reyes was going to say when I reported this. When I called him, his first response was a very long silence. Then he said, "She didn't make you cry." "No, sir." Another silence. Cole, every other person who stood in that corridor today left in some form of professional distress. "Yes, sir, I heard." "What did you do?" "I thought about it honestly. I held the door when she came through from the east corridor, sir, and I didn't look at her directly." The silence that followed was the kind that means someone is thinking very hard about something they did not expect to be thinking about. "All right," Reyes said finally, "you've got the post." I walked back to my bunk that night with the feeling that I had stumbled into something much larger than a guard rotation, and that the smart thing to do would be to proceed carefully, quietly, and without drawing any more attention to myself than necessary. I told myself I would do exactly that. I was not very good at doing exactly that. The next morning I was back at my post before dawn, because I am the kind of person who arrives early, and the corridor was still quiet. The plants stood in their silver pots. The recycled air moved in its slow climate-controlled cycle, and somewhere on the other side of that door, the ruler of 40 star systems was presumably doing whatever rulers did before the day officially began. I did not expect anything to happen. That is, I have learned precisely when things begin. The door opened at 5:42 and Velitra stepped into the corridor, wearing simpler robes than before, her silver hair pulled back with something that caught the light. She was carrying a small object. Identify, turning it slowly in her fingers the way people turn things when they are thinking. She looked at me. I did not quite look at her. Same as before. She walked to the end of the corridor, stood at the viewport there, and looked at the stars. For a long time, I watched the corridor. Neither of us spoke. After perhaps 20 minutes, she turned and walked back. As she passed me, she paused for exactly 1 second, not 2. "What is your name?" she said. Not a question, more like a test. "Ethan Cole," I said. She considered this with the expression of someone tasting something unfamiliar and not yet decided on it. Then she went inside. I stood in the corridor for the rest of my shift with the feeling that something had just shifted, quietly and without ceremony, in a direction I could not yet identify. Whatever it was, I was almost certain it was going to complicate my life considerably. I was right. The fourth day started like the others, which is to say quietly, with the plants and the recycled air, and specific kind of silence that very important spaces have when they are not currently being important. I had learned by then that Empress Vale. Thrawn rose before most of the station and stood at the viewport at the end of the corridor for approximately 20 minutes every morning. I had learned that she preferred to be neither addressed nor ignored during this time, which is a precise and demanding balance that I was apparently achieving by accident. I had not spoken to her beyond The two exchanges as we had managed, she had not spoken to me, and yet somehow there was a quality to the silence between us that felt different from the silence between a guard and the person he is guarding. I could not explain it. Better than that, it was simply different. Then on the fourth evening she spoke to me through the door. I was standing at my post just after station night had begun and the corridor lights had dimmed to their low blue evening setting. The rest of her retinue had retired. The hall was empty. I was thinking about nothing in particular, which is something I am good at, when her voice came through the door panel, not on the comm, just through the material of the door itself, because she was standing close to it on the other side. Unison. Yes, I said. A pause. Why do your kind apologize to objects you collide with? I stood very still for a moment. Outside of initial briefings, no one had ever asked me a question quite like that before. I'm not sure all of us do, I said carefully, but some of us do it because the apology is a reflex. It comes from the same place as the apology you'd give a person. Sometimes the brain doesn't sort that out in time. Another pause. Longer this time. That is inefficient. Yes, I agreed. And yet you do it. Most of us sometimes. Yes. There was a silence that felt like thinking. Then, curious, she said nothing more that night, but she was at the door again the following evening, and the evening after that. The questions were strange and direct, and never what I expected. She asked why humans named their vehicles. She asked what the concept of embarrassment felt like from the inside, which was a question that, ironically, I had trouble answering without becoming somewhat embarrassed. She asked why humans, when very happy, sometimes produced liquid from their eyes, which was a function she found deeply counterintuitive. I answered as plainly as I could, because plain answers seemed to be what she wanted. I did not perform humility or defer extravagantly. I was just tired at the end of long shifts, and the easiest thing to do was tell the truth. I think that was the part she found most unusual. On the seventh day of the summit it happened. I was walking 2 steps behind her through the secondary corridor on the way to the morning session when a figure came around the corner fast, moving with the specific urgency that triggers every instinct a trained guard has. He was Vilhari, the tall, gray-skinned species from the outer systems, and he was holding something that the station's passive sensors had apparently failed to flag. Because it was built from organic material rather than metal, I did not think that is the truth of it. There was no internal calculation, no weighing of options. He moved to Porter and I moved between them. The impact was hard. I am not a large man, but I had leverage and position and the specific advantage of having been in the right place, and I am trained for close quarters control. I had him disarmed and on the floor in approximately 4 seconds. The thing he had been holding skidded across the corridor and stopped against the base of one of the silver-potted plants. My heart was going fast. My hands were completely steady, which is a thing about me that has always been slightly strange. I looked up to check. She was unharmed. She was standing exactly where she had been standing. She had not moved. She was looking at me with an expression that I had never seen on her face before, and I could not immediately name it. "Are you injured?" I asked her. She did not answer right away. "Empress," I said, "are you injured?" "No," she said, in a voice that was quieter than her Usual tone. Are you? I looked down. There was a cut along my left forearm, where his elbow had caught me on the way down. It was not serious. Minor, I said. I'm fine. The rest of her retinue appeared at the end of the corridor 30 seconds later, having responded to the alert, weapons out, looking for a threat that was already on the floor, zip tied to itself with the restraints I carry on my belt. One of her senior guards, a broad-shouldered Athorian named Sorveth, who had looked at me like furniture every day for a week, stopped and stared. Then he looked at his Empress, then back at me, then at the attacker on the floor, then back at me. I stood up, checked my restraints were secure, and calmed station security to collect the detainee. Standard procedure, clean and simple. One of the junior aides approached me and, in very formal tone, said, "Honorable Guardian, what lineage do you carry?" I processed the question. For a moment, I knew enough about Athorian culture to understand that warriors recited their bloodlines before and after significant acts. It was how they contextualized courage, how they located it within a framework of family and history and inherited strength. Ethan Cole, I said, from Ohio. The aide blinked in the elder line. My parents are from Ohio too, I said. My grandmother as well. She's still alive. Actually, she makes very good pie. There was a silence. Sorveth made a sound that might have been a suppressed reaction of some kind. I chose not to examine it too closely. That afternoon, the station's news feed began running a clip. Someone in the corridor had a passive recorder running, and the angle caught everything clearly. The attacker coming around the corner, the guard stepping in front, the 4 seconds, the detainee on the floor, the guard checking on the Empress before checking on himself. The caption read, "Human guard defends Empress Valithra. Motive unclear." I found this out during my meal break when a colleague slid a tablet across the table toward me with the expression of someone who had just watched something they couldn't quite process. "That's you," he said. "Yes," I said. "You checked if she was okay before you checked your own arm?" "Yes." He stared at me. Why? I thought about it. It genuinely had not occurred to me to do it any other way. She was the one someone was running at, I said. It seemed like the more urgent question. He continued to stare at me for a few more seconds, then he picked up his fork and went back to eating in the manner of someone who has decided that some questions do not have answers they are currently equipped to process. That evening, late after the session had ended and the corridor was quiet again, I was at my post in the dimmed blue light when the door opened and Valithra stepped out. Not her usual morning routine. This was different. She was alone, without attendants, and she stood in the corridor for a moment as if orienting herself to something. Then she walked toward me with that precise, unhurried step, and she stopped very close enough that I was suddenly very aware that I was not looking at her directly, which was less a cultural choice and more that I genuinely could not decide where to focus when someone was standing that near to me, and I was trying to appear calm. She reached out and placed her hand briefly on my right shoulder, not a grip, a placement. 3 seconds, maybe 4, then she withdrew it and went back inside. I stood very still in the corridor for a long time. After that, my pulse was doing something I chose not to examine medically. An hour later, Sorveth appeared in the corridor. He had the look of someone who had been sent to deliver information. He was not entirely comfortable delivering. "The gesture you just received," he said. "Yes," I said, "Her Imperial Majesty does not place her hand in that manner except upon those she regards as equals." I processed this. "In 40-star systems," I said slowly, "how many people has she regarded as equals?" Sorveth was quiet for a moment. "Before tonight," he said, "the count was 3. He left. I stood in the corridor, alone with the plants in the dim light, and the particular enormous weight of that sentence. I thought about calling Rays to report it, then I decided to wait until morning because some things need a few hours and a night's sleep before they can be put into official language. I stood at my post until my relief arrived. I handed over the corridor quietly, walked to my bunk, lay down, and looked at the ceiling for a long time. Somewhere on the station, in a suite full of careful and ancient protocol, the ruler of 40-star systems was presumably doing the same. I did not know what to do with that. I was beginning to think it might not matter whether I knew. I woke up famous, not in the way where someone says, "You did a nice thing and people noticed," famous in the way where you calm your own device to check your shift schedule and it takes 45 seconds to load because 17 separate galactic news networks are trying to reach the account simultaneously. Famous in the way where your colleague Greg Holt is standing at the end of the bunk corridor holding a mug of something hot and staring at his own tablet with the expression of someone watching a controlled demolition happening. Slow motion. "Cole," he said when I appeared. "How are you feeling?" I said. "That's probably appropriate," he said. He handed me his tablet. The main feed was running the corridor clip on a continuous loop with different commentary overlaid depending on the network. The Authority Imperial News Consortium was the most dramatic. They had the clip running at half speed with a panel of commentators who were all talking at once. I couldn't understand the language, but the energy was clear. It was the energy of people who had just witnessed something that was either extraordinary or catastrophic and hadn't yet decided which. The Galactic Assembly Observer, which was the Coalition's main neutral broadcast service, had a simpler headline: Empress's equality gesture toward human guard breaks centuries of authority protocol. I sat down on the edge of my bunk and read the shoulder placement. That was the center of everything. What I had experienced as a brief, quiet moment in a dimly lit corridor had apparently been witnessed by Sorveth and 2 junior attendants, recorded on passive sensors and interpreted by every authority protocol expert in the known galaxy within approximately 90 minutes. The gesture, according to one expert who seemed to be barely keeping herself composed on camera, was called the Vereka. It meant equality of standing. It was not a gift, not an honor, not a recognition of service. It was a statement of fundamental equivalence, one person to another stripped of all rank. In the history of the Authority Dominion, a reigning Empress had performed the Vereka exactly 3 times, once to a general who had saved her life as a child, once to a philosopher whose work she had read for 30 years, once to her own predecessor on the day she accepted the throne, now a 4th time to a guard from Ohio who had tackled an attacker. A corridor then asked her if she was okay. I read the article twice. Then I put the tablet down and went to get my own something hot. The station's mess had an unusual atmosphere for 6:40 People were looking at their devices, with various expressions. A few of them looked at me when I walked in and then away and then back with a particular uncertainty of people who are trying to decide whether to say something. I made it to the drink station and back without anyone speaking to me, which I appreciated. My calm pinged Ray's. "Cole," he said when I answered, "Sir." I said, "Are you aware of the current situation?" "I've been reading," I said. "Good," he said, "then you know that her Imperial Council has issued a formal request for clarification. They want to know whether the Vareka was an error in translation, whether the passive censors captured the moment incorrectly, whether the attendants present misidentified the gesture." I kept walking back toward the bunk area. "What did she say?" A pause. "She has not responded to the council's request." I stopped walking. "She hasn't said anything." "She has said nothing." "Cole, not a correction, not a confirmation, nothing. You have to understand what that means in A3 political terms. The Empress does not leave things unaddressed. She does not allow ambiguity in public matters. The fact that she has neither confirmed nor denied the Vareka is in itself a statement. I sat down in a quiet corner of the corridor and thought about that. And on our side I asked, "You have been temporarily relieved of your post, pending a formal review. Standard procedure when a guard becomes a point of political attention. It's not punitive, Cole, it's just process." "Understood," I said. "You'll be interviewed by the Coalition Liaison Office this morning. Answer honestly. Don't embellish, don't minimize." "Yes, sir." He paused. "Cole, you checked if she was okay before you looked at your own arm?" "Yes, sir." Why, I had answered this question already to my colleague at dinner, and the answer had not gotten any more complicated overnight. She was the one someone was running at. It seemed like the more pressing question. Another pause. "Right," Rhea said. He sounded like someone who was very tired and also slightly moved, which I thought was probably an unusual combination for him. "Get some sleep first. Interview at 900. The interview lasted 2 hours and covered essentially everything: my background, my training, my decision-making in the corridor, my interactions with the Empress, my understanding of Ethelred, cultural protocol. The liaison officer conducting it was a woman named Clara Brent, a career diplomat with 20 years in cross-species relations who had particular skill of listening with her whole face. She asked me near the end whether I had known what the Vareka meant when it happened. "No," I said. "Were you aware of the cultural significance of the shoulder placement as a gesture of equality?" "Not in detail." I knew the Ethelred had complex gesture-based protocols. I didn't know the specifics of that one. "So you didn't respond to it in any culturally coded way?" I stood still and didn't say anything, I said, which was honestly because I wasn't sure what had just happened. Clara Brent made a note on her tablet. Something in her expression shifted briefly into something that was close to amusement, though she kept it professional. "That may," she said carefully, "have been exactly the right response." While I was being interviewed, the story was growing in ways I wasn't tracking in real time. I found out afterward through various sources over the following hours. A Velhari senator had made a formal address to the Galactic Assembly, questioning the appropriateness of the summit itself, given what he described as the Empress's apparent deterioration of judgment. He used words that implied her interest in a human guard was Evidence of instability, his speech was being replayed extensively. Then, something happened that no one expected. Velithra attended the morning session of the summit. She had not been required to, given the diplomatic situation, and absence would have been fully protocol appropriate. Instead, she arrived at the session hall at 9:10, exactly 5 minutes after the start time, which everyone present apparently noted as a deliberate choice, since Athori rulers never arrive late unless they are making a point. She sat through the morning agenda without incident. When the Velhari senator arrived at the session hall and took his seat across from the Ithori delegation, there was a visible tension in the room. At the midpoint recess, another delegate, a Gorvani trade representative, made a comment in the lobby that was picked up by ambient recording. He said something to the effect that the galaxy's oldest spacefaring civilization was making decisions based on the sentimentality of a primitive species. He said primitive twice, apparently for emphasis. Velithra was standing 12 feet away when he said it. She turned toward him, and every account I heard described the moment the same way. The room went quiet, not because there was a loud sound, because the quality of her stillness communicated something that caused everyone nearby to stop moving. She spoke in standard, which was itself significant because she almost exclusively spoke Athari in formal settings. She said in a measured and precise tone that the Athori dominion had records of human civilizations spanning 2,000 years. She said that in those records there were 17 concepts, which she then began listing, for which the Etheri language had no native word. Because the Etheri had no native equivalent, she went through all 17. It took 4 minutes. The room stayed quiet for all of it. The list included things like stubbornness as a chosen virtue rather than a character flaw. It included the practice of maintaining hope after evidence suggests hope is unwarranted. It included the specific act of protecting something you are not obligated to protect simply because it needs protecting. She finished the list, turned back to the session without waiting for a response, and returned to her seat. The ambient recording of that moment was the second clip to go widely distributed within 6 hours. I watched it in my bunk that evening on the small personal screen mounted above the sleep unit. I watched it twice. The second time I was looking specifically at her expression while she spoke, because something about it was different from her usual public face, and it took me a moment to identify what she looked like. Someone who had decided something, not made a decision in the sense of selecting between options, decided in the deeper sense, the sense where you have arrived somewhere and you know you are not leaving. I turned the screen off and lay in the dark. My comm pinged once, a text message from Ray's post reinstated at 600, report as usual. Below it, a second message from an internal system address I didn't recognize. This is Sorveth. I do not normally use text communication. I am making an exception. You should know that she asked for your reinstatement herself. She went around your command structure. 3 of your superiors have been notified by her office directly. They have complied. I thought you should know this. Also, you handled the corridor correctly. I read that message several times. Then I put the comm down, pulled the sleep covering up, and lay there, thinking about what it meant to have an Empress go around 3 command levels of the coalition, diplomatic security, Division to make sure a junior guard got his post back. I thought about her, standing in that lobby speaking in a language she preferred not to use in public, listing 17 things that humans had, that the oldest spacefaring civilization in the galaxy did not. I thought about the shoulder placement in the dim blue light. I thought about a lot of things. Eventually, very late in the station's artificial night cycle, I fell asleep. And for the first time in a week, I did not dream about corridors or threat angles or protocol procedures. I dreamed about the viewport at the end of the hall and the stars beyond it, and someone standing beside me looking at them. I did not examine this too carefully. I just woke up at 5:30, put on my uniform, and went back to work. She was already at the viewport when I arrived. This was not unusual by now. 14 days into the summit, the morning routine had settled into something that was never discussed, but completely established. She rose before the station's morning cycle. She came to the viewport. She stood and looked at the stars. I stood at my post and watched the corridor. We did not speak. The silence was the kind that had developed its own particular texture over the days, comfortable in the way that silences between people who understand each other can become. But that morning she turned from the viewport before her usual time, and when she turned, she did not walk back toward the suite. She walked toward me, and she stopped a measured distance away, and she looked at me with the expression she had worn in the lobby during the list, the one that meant she had arrived somewhere. There is a council motion, she said. I waited, a formal request that I return to the Dominion capital before the summit concludes. It is framed as procedural. Her tone was even, but there was something underneath it. Controlled but present. It is not procedural. What is it? I asked. A test, she said, of whether I am still capable of putting the Dominion's interests above my own inclinations. I thought about that. Are those two things in conflict? She looked at me with the directness that I had grown accustomed to, that focused, complete attention that made you feel like being seen was both an honor and a significant responsibility. My counsel believes they are. What do you believe? The question came out before I thought it through, which was something that had been happening more frequently in our conversations. In the beginning, I had been careful, measured, answering rather than asking. But careful had gradually given way to something more natural, and she had never indicated that she found my questions unwelcome. She looked at me for a long moment. I believe, she said slowly, that I have ruled for 60 of your years. I have made decisions that shaped populations. I have drawn borders and ended conflicts and built institutions that will outlast me by centuries. I have not in 60 years made a single decision based on what I personally wanted rather than what was strategically correct. I find, she said very quietly, that I do not know how to do that, make a decision based on what I want. I have no practice with it. It is a skill your kind appears to develop very early. It's not always comfortable. I said honestly. No, she said. I imagine not. A pause. What would you do if you're facing this choice between the strategic path and the personal one? I thought about it. The real answer, not the diplomatic one. I'd probably do the thing that scares me more. I said, in my experience, the thing that feels scariest is usually the thing that matters. She looked at me for so long that I started to wonder if I had overstepped Then she said very quietly and with absolute precision, "Humans are terrifying," I said. "I know." She went back. I stood at my post. The corridor was very quiet. The plants in their silver pots stood as they always stood, patient and still. 2 hours later, my comm lit up with 17 simultaneous messages, and I knew, without reading a single one of them, that something very large had just happened. Valithra had called for a full session of the Galactic Assembly, not a panel, not a subcommittee, the full assembly. Every seated member, every accredited observer, every diplomatic delegation present on Station Caldera was summoned to the main hall at 1400 hours, and Authori Empress had never addressed the Galactic Assembly person, not once in the 1,100 years since the Assembly had been established. The Authori had always sent representatives, always maintained the protocol distance of a civilization that considered itself above the proceedings. Even when participating in them, the station went into a particular kind of controlled frenzy. Security tiers were elevated. Seating had to be arranged. 3 separate networks set up live broadcast equipment in the corridors outside the main hall. I was reassigned to corridor security for the duration, which meant I was not in the hall itself, but I was close enough to hear the ambient sound shift when she walked in, the specific quality of silence that a large group of beings produces when something they did not expect is happening right in front of them. I listened through the open comm channels. Her voice was clear and measured. She spoke in standard throughout, which was the second consecutive time she had done this in a public setting, and which commentators afterward described as itself a political statement, a gesture of meeting others on their ground. She spoke for 19 minutes. I cannot give you every word of it, but I can give you what stayed with me, which is most of it, because I have a good memory for things that matter. She said that the Authori Dominion had spent 11 centuries observing humanity from a careful distance, and that the consensus of that observation had been that humans were a young species, prone to emotion, inefficient in governance, inconsistent in philosophy, and unlikely to achieve the level of civilization that would merit genuine partnership. She said that this assessment was accurate as far as it went. Then she said that it did not go far enough. She said that in 14 days on the station she had encountered something she had not encountered in 60 years of ruling and a lifetime of study. She listed what she saw, not in abstract terms, in specific ones. She talked about a guard who held a door open without ceremony, not because he was required to, not because he was performing courtesy, but because he simply noticed someone was walking through it and the door needed holding. She talked about a person who moved between a threat and another living being without calculation, out of an instinct that was not self-protective, but other protective. She talked about someone who, when asked what he would do in the face of a frightening choice, said he would do the thing that scared him most because that was probably the right one. She said that the Ethui had a word for strategic courage, for rational bravery, for calculated sacrifice. They had no word for the specific kind of courage that arose not from calculation, but from caring. No word for the particular stubbornness of someone who did the right thing not because the right thing was advantageous, but simply because it was right and they were there. She said she had spent 60 years believing that emotional reasoning was a weakness of undeveloped minds, she said. She had recently been given reason to reconsider that position. Then she formally proposed the Ethui Dominions' first equal partnership treaty with another civilization with humanity. The assembly was quiet for a very long time. Then someone began to applaud, and within 5 seconds the sound was too large to track individual sources. I was standing in a corridor with a plant in a silver pot to my left and a viewport to my right, and my comm was ringing with about 40 different alerts, and I was very careful not to let my face do the thing my face apparently wanted to do, because I was on duty and there were 2 network cameras visible from where I was standing. I was mostly successful. The council motion to remove her came 40 minutes after the speech submitted through official channels as expected. 11 members of her inner council, all of them older than most human institutions, formally triggered the no confidence procedure that could, under Athori law, call a governance tribunal. The tribunal required 2/3 of the council's senior military leadership to support it before it could proceed. 14 Athori generals withdrew their support from the motion within the hour. 14 out of 14 who had served under her personally. Sorvath was the last to file his withdrawal, and he filed it with a single attached note that someone leaked to the networks. Within minutes, it read, "I have served the Empress for 31 years. In that time, I have seen her make 2,000 decisions. She has been wrong 4 times. I am not willing to act as though this is the 5th. The motion failed. By station evening, the treaty framework had been formally acknowledged by both the Athori delegation and the Human Coalition representative. There were months of work ahead, years probably, before anything binding would be signed, but the acknowledgement itself was historic, and everyone who understood the scale of it was saying so in every language the station system supported. I was quietly promoted 3 grades that afternoon, an administrative action processed by Rays without ceremony communicated to me via a brief text. "Congratulations, the paperwork is done. Don't make it weird." I was reassigned to continue as Valathro's designated guard for the duration of the summit. The assignment came from her office, directly, bypassing again 3 levels of my command structure. Rays forwarded the authorization with a note that said, "Just go." So I went. The last evening of the summit's official program, after the sessions had concluded and the delegations were preparing their departures, I was at the viewport at the end of the corridor, not on duty. My shift had ended an hour earlier. I was just there because it was quiet, and I had gotten into the habit of looking at the stars from that particular spot. I heard her before I saw her, not footsteps, but the specific quality of air in the corridor shifting, the way it does when someone tall is moving through it with purpose. She came to stand beside me at the viewport, not behind me, not at a formal distance, beside me. Neither of us spoke for a while. The stars were dense on this side of the station, a field of them without the obstructions. You got closer to the system center, just open, continuous, very old light. "I do not know what this is," she said. She was not looking at me, she was looking at the stars. I understood that the statement was not about the stars. "Me neither," I said. A pause. "I am not accustomed to things I do not know." "I know," I said. She turned her head slightly toward me, not Quite looking the way you orient toward something you are still deciding about. Your kind seems to find not knowing tolerable. We have a lot of practice. I said it gets easier. Another pause. I am willing, she said carefully, as if placing each word with intention, to find out. I looked at the stars. I thought about Ohio and pie in 14 days. That had somehow become most significant. 2 weeks of my life without my ever having decided that was what they would be. I thought about held doors and short straws and a corridor with plants in silver pots, and how things that seem entirely random are sometimes, looking back, not random at all. Yeah, I said. She did not move closer. I did not move closer. We stood at the viewport, two people of very different origins and very different distances traveled, and we looked at the stars together, and it was not dramatic. It was not announced. It was not the kind of moment that history captures cleanly, but it was real, completely, unmistakably real. The way quiet moments usually are, when they are the ones that actually count. I called my mother the next morning. It was late in Ohio, but she answered on the second ring, the way she always did. When she somehow already knew, I told her I had something to tell her. Something I was not sure how to explain. Yet because it was large and new, and I was still finding the edges of it. She said, then start at the beginning and don't leave anything out. So I told her about the door. She cried a little. I did too, when I thought she wasn't listening. I'm not going to say I knew where things were heading from there. I'm not going to claim that the answer was obvious from the start, that some part of me understood from the moment I walked into that briefing room and saw Ray's with his arms crossed exactly how the story would unfold. But I will say this: somewhere in the galaxy right now, there is a ruler of 40 star systems who is learning what not knowing feels like. And somewhere on a station orbiting a star that does not have a human name, there are plants in silver pots at the end of a corridor, and a viewport that faces an angle of space where the stars are especially dense, and if you stood there long enough, some mornings you would see two people standing at it, neither of them saying very much, both of them looking at the same stars. That is where it starts. That is where it was always going to start, and I suspect it is only the beginning of where it is going. The galaxy, as far as I can tell, is still not sure what to make of it. I think that is probably fine. I think some things are allowed to take their time.